It was a gray, overcast morning in the quiet town of Maple Ridge, Ohio. The air felt unusually heavy, not just because of the weather, but because the community was grieving the sudden loss of one of their most beloved residents, Walter Jenkins. A retired mailman and Vietnam veteran, Walter was the kind of man who remembered every birthday on his delivery route, brought groceries to shut-ins, and spent his weekends volunteering at the animal shelter. His death, caused by what doctors said was heart failure in his sleep, came as a shock to everyone, but none more than to his constant companion, a golden retriever named Buddy. Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was family. Walter had adopted him 5 years earlier, rescuing him from near starvation after he was found wandering the woods during a brutal winter. From that day forward, the two had been inseparable. Buddy followed Walter everywhere, to the store, to church, even to his weekly poker nights with other veterans. Their bond was undeniable. The funeral was held at Maple Ridge's only chapel, a modest white wooden building with stained glass windows and a bell that hadn't rung in over a decade. Inside, mourners filled the pews, all dressed in black, some dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The casket rested at the front, closed and draped with an American flag in honor of Walter's service. A soft organ tune played in the background as the minister began to speak about Walter's life, his contributions, his kindness. Buddy lay at the base of the casket, a quiet presence. He had been sitting there since the funeral began, his head resting on his paws, seemingly calm. But as the minister began reading a prayer, something changed. Buddy lifted his head sharply. His ears perked. His eyes locked onto the casket, and then he barked. It was a short, sharp bark that startled everyone. A few people chuckled nervously, thinking it was an outburst of canine grief. The minister paused, gave a patient smile, and tried to continue. But Buddy barked again and again, each time louder and more urgent. Now he was standing, pacing, growling low in his throat. He circled the casket, pawing at its base. His tail wasn't wagging. It was stiff, alert. He scratched at the side, let out a loud whine, then barked with all his strength. Susan Jenkins, Walter's only daughter, stood from the front row and rushed to him. She kneeled beside the dog, gently grabbing his collar. "Buddy, it's okay. Boy," she whispered through tears. "He's gone." But Buddy wouldn't settle. He growled at the casket, tugged away from her grip, and placed both front paws against the wood. He let out a series of frantic barks that echoed through the chapel. Murmurs filled the room. Maybe the dog's just upset. He's confused. Poor thing, he doesn't understand. But others weren't so sure. From the third row, an elderly man leaned over to his wife. "Dogs don't act like that unless they sense something," he muttered. "I've seen it before." In the back of the room, a young man whispered, "That's not grief. That's a warning." The minister looked over at the funeral director, who stood nervously near the back. The organ music faded out. Susan stood up, her face pale, and looked at the casket. Buddy continued barking, louder than ever, now clawing frantically at the wood. Something was wrong. Everyone felt it. A retired nurse who had worked in hospice stood slowly and approached the casket. She stared down at Walter's face, visible through the glass panel. After a long pause, she spoke in a voice just above a whisper. "He doesn't look dead." People gasped. Buddy barked again, and suddenly, nobody could ignore it anymore. The chapel, moments ago wrapped in quiet mourning, was now full of unease. Buddy's relentless barking had pierced through everyone's grief, and now it refused to be background noise. There was urgency in his voice, panic, even as he clawed at the coffin like his very life depended on it. Susan stood frozen. Her eyes were wide, heart pounding. She had always trusted Buddy's instincts. He had once led her to a neighbor who'd fallen in their backyard, during a snowstorm. He'd once refused to walk into a house with a gas leak before anyone even smelled it. This wasn't just emotional reaction, this was different. He was trying to tell them something. The retired nurse, Mrs. Kinley, stepped closer to the casket. Again, her brows furrowed. She leaned in, studying Walter's face. "His color," she muttered aloud. "It's all wrong. He looks too pink, like someone who's sleeping." A few heads turned. Someone in the crowd gave a quiet gasp at the funeral director, Mr. Hafford, cleared his throat nervously and stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Please, everyone, let's keep calm. I assure you, the deceased was properly examined. There's no need for concern." But no one was listening. All eyes were on Buddy, still pawing, still howling with painful desperation. From the third row, Tom Willis, a retired paramedic and longtime friend of Walter's, stood up. "Hafford," he said firmly, "I need you to open that casket." Hafford looked shocked. I can't do that. It's against protocol." "I'm not asking," Tom said, his voice rising. "You've got a dog acting like this man's still alive. You've got medical professionals saying his appearance is off. If we're wrong, we've just opened a casket. If we're right, a man's life is on the line." The chapel murmured in agreement. People were getting out of their pews now, whispering and huddling together. Susan turned to Hafford, eyes filled with tears. "Please, if there's even the smallest chance that he's alive, I need to know. We all need to know." Hafford hesitated, sweat building on his brow. He turned to the minister, who gave him a grim nod. With shaking hands, he stepped forward and unlocked the glass viewing panel on the top half of the casket. The room was silent, so quiet you could hear the latch click. Buddy stopped barking. Everyone held their breath as Hafford slowly lifted the glass panel. Walter's face was perfectly still. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted. Nothing looked obviously wrong, no movement, no signs of life. But Mrs. Kinley stepped closer, gently took Walter's hand, and pressed her fingers to his wrist. "I'm telling you," she whispered, closing her eyes. "I swear I feel warmth." A faint pulse. The words hit like a bomb. People gasped again. A few even backed away from the casket, too shaken to believe what they were hearing. Hafford stood frozen, hands trembling at his sides. Tom rushed forward and leaned over Walter, pulling out his phone flashlight and checking for chest movement. His chest just rose. He cried out, "Someone call 911 now." Susan screamed, not from fear, but from hope. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her as she clung to the side of the casket. "Dad, Dad, please, Buddy barked again, this time a high-pitched yelp of joy, and wagged his tail for the first time that day. The minister, stunned beyond words, dropped to a pew and muttered a prayer under his breath. Chaos followed as someone ran outside to direct the ambulance. People were crying, hugging, praying, trying to understand what was happening. Susan bent over her father's body, pressing her hand to his cheek. "He's warm," she said through sobs. "Oh God, he's warm." Buddy circled the casket, now whining with joy, as if he knew he'd been heard. Walter Jenkins wasn't dead, and now the whole town knew something incredible was happening. The air in the chapel was now charged with disbelief and urgency. People who had arrived with tissues for tears were now frantically pulling out phones, calling emergency services, or simply standing in shock. What had been a somber farewell, just minutes earlier, had turned into something no one had ever witnessed before. A funeral suddenly interrupted by hope. Buddy remained close to Walter's coffin, tail wagging nervously, as if he knew his job wasn't done just yet. He circled back and forth, every so often pausing to place his paw gently on the casket. His eyes scanned the faces in the room, urging them to act. Susan sat beside her father's body now, clutching his hand with trembling fingers. "Come back, Dad," she whispered. "Please just hang on." She was still crying, but her tears had shifted from grief to desperate hope. The sound of sirens blaring in the distance jolted the room further. Within minutes, 2 paramedics rushed into the chapel carrying emergency gear. One of them, Maria Vega, took one look at Walter and immediately moved into action. "Clear the space," she ordered. "We need to assess now." Tom, the retired paramedic who had insisted on opening the casket, stood back and watched nervously as Maria and her partner checked for pulse, breathing, and responsiveness. She pulled out a portable heart monitor and attached leads to Walter's. Chest.beep. A single faint blip on the screen made Maria pause. Then it came again, .beep, .beep, . Faint but steady, she confirmed, her voice sharp with astonishment. "He's got a pulse." Gasps spread across the chapel. People covered their mouths. One elderly woman dropped her prayer book. Even Hefford, the funeral director who had moments ago tried to stop the interruption, sat down hard on the front pew, stunned into silence. Buddy barked again, this time shorter, as if affirming the paramedic's words. Maria looked at the dog and gave a small, respectful nod. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" Her partner, a younger man named Daniel, began preparing an oxygen mask and 4. "We need to get him out of here now." Susan looked up at the medics, barely able to speak. "Is he going to make it?" Maria paused for a moment, looking at Walter's shallow breathing and pale complexion. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but he's got a fighting chance, and that's more than he had 10 minutes ago." As they worked to stabilize Walter, the chapel had split into 2 groups, those who watched in reverent silence and those who couldn't stop murmuring. Questions flew across the room. How did the hospital miss this? Wasn't he examined by a coroner? What kind of condition causes this? But above all, one statement repeated over and over, that dog saved his life. Outside, the news had already spread beyond the chapel walls. A few people were on the phone with local radio stations. Others were live streaming, capturing the surreal sight of paramedics wheeling a supposedly deceased man out of his own funeral while his dog walked beside him. Susan followed close, never letting go of her father's hand. Buddy trotted next to the stretcher, tongue hanging, finally calm. His eyes never left Walter Dot as the ambulance doors closed. Maria looked at Susan and said, "We'll take care of him. You stay strong." Susan nodded, holding Buddy tight. Dot as the vehicle sped away. A heavy silence lingered behind. The minister, still holding his Bible, looked around and finally said what no one else could. "I think we just witnessed a miracle." And though the crowd was still too stunned to speak, in their hearts they knew it was true. The ambulance tore through the sleepy roads of Maple Ridge, its sirens screaming with urgency. Inside, Maria and Daniel worked in tandem, carefully monitoring Walter's weak vitals. Oxygen flowed through the mask, covering his nose and mouth, and his fingers twitched faintly, as if responding to the stimulation. Susan sat quietly in the corner of the ambulance, Buddy lying pressed against her legs, eyes fixed on Walter. "BP is climbing slow but steady," Daniel reported. This guy was hanging on by a thread. Maria glanced at the monitor. If that dog hadn't made a scene, he'd be underground by now. Susan wiped a tear and whispered, "He always said Buddy was special. I thought he meant emotionally. Not this." At the hospital, a team of doctors waited, prepped and ready after being alerted en route. The moment the doors flew open, Walter was rushed into the trauma unit. Susan stayed behind in the waiting room, holding Buddy close, trying to make sense of everything. One moment, she was planning to bury her father. The next, he was fighting for his life. Hours dragged by. Buddy refused to sit still. Every time a nurse passed by or a door clicked open, he lifted his head and whined softly. The waiting room television played news coverage of the miraculous event, already dubbed the funeral that turned into a rescue. The small town story had reached the outside world, and headlines flashed with images of Buddy barking at the coffin and Walter being wheeled away. Then finally, just before sunrise, a doctor stepped into the room. "Are you Susan Jenkins?" he asked. She jumped to her feet, nodding furiously. Buddy stood beside her, tail twitching in anticipation. "Your father is stable," the doctor said with a tired smile. "He's still unconscious, but his brain scans look promising. We believe he suffered from a rare cataleptic episode something that mimics death so closely that even medical professionals can be fooled." His heart rate slowed to nearly nothing. His breathing was shallow, and he was non-responsive to light or sound. "But he wasn't actually dead?" Susan asked, breathless. "No," the doctor confirmed. "And frankly, your dog may be the only reason he's alive. Without that disturbance, he would have been buried in hours. I've never seen anything like this." Susan dropped to her knees, hugging Buddy tightly. "You saved him," she whispered into the fur around his neck. "You knew." The doctor watched the scene quietly, then added, "I'd like to keep Buddy nearby. If Walter wakes up and hears a familiar voice or bark, it could help his brain reconnect faster." Susan nodded. "He won't leave his side. He never has." They were moved into a private room. Walter lay in a hospital bed, connected to machines, pale but alive. Buddy hopped onto the couch in the corner, curling up with eyes focused on Walter's every breath. The room filled with silence, but it wasn't fearful. It was peaceful, as if everyone believed the worst was finally over. Later that day, a nurse entered quietly, bringing in a tray. She paused when she saw Buddy sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at Walter's face. Then, without warning, Walter's hand twitched. The monitor beeped faster. Susan leapt up. "Dad?" she whispered, moving closer. Walter's eyes fluttered. His lips parted. Then he whispered, faint but clear, "Buddy." The room froze. Susan gasped. The nurse called for the doctor. But Buddy simply stood on his hind legs, placed both front paws gently on the bed, and gave a soft, joyful bark. Was coming back, and everyone knew without a shadow of doubt that it never would have happened without Buddy. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beep of the heart monitor and the occasional squeak of a nurse's shoe in the hallway. But inside, life was stirring in the most miraculous way. Walter Jenkins, once presumed dead, had just whispered the name of the very dog who saved him Buddy. Susan stood frozen. Her hand covered her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. "Dad?" she whispered again, stepping closer to the bed. Walter's eyelids fluttered. He tried to speak, but only a raspy breath escaped. The nurse pressed the emergency call button, and within seconds, the room filled with medical staff. "Vitals are improving," one said, checking the monitor. "He's responding to sound," added another. Buddy let out a soft whine, tail wagging. Slowly, he stepped forward and rested his head on Walter's arm. Susan watched, stunned, as her father's fingers twitched once more. The doctor arrived moments later, took one look at Walter, and smiled in disbelief. "He's coming back," he confirmed. "This is the moment we hoped for." For the next several hours, the medical team worked diligently to stabilize Walter's condition. They monitored his oxygen levels, administered fluids, and conducted scans to check for any signs of brain trauma. All the while, Buddy never left Walter's side. When nurses needed access to the bed, he moved only a few inches, always returning to his spot with quiet loyalty. Outside the hospital, the story had become a sensation. News vans lined the street, reporters broadcasting live updates. The miracle at Maple Ridge, they called it. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Buddy the Hero and #Back from the Coffin. People across the country sent messages of support, prayers, and gifts addressed to the man and his dog. Inside, Susan sat next to the hospital bed, holding Walter's hand and stroking Buddy's head. "You gave us another chance," she whispered. "You gave me my dad back." Later that evening, Walter opened his eyes fully for the first time. They were tired and confused, but alert. He blinked, looked around the room, then focused on Buddy. "Hey, boy," he croaked. Susan let out a half-laugh, half-sob, and leaned forward. "You're okay, Dad. You're in the hospital. You've been through a lot," Walter's brow furrowed. "Last thing I remember, I was in bed, then nothing, just quiet. You had an episode," she explained gently. "Something that made everyone think you were gone. They held your funeral. You were in a coffin, Dad." Walter blinked. "A funeral?" Susan nodded. "But Buddy wouldn't let it happen. He barked until someone noticed. He knew you were alive. He saved your life." Walter turned to look at Buddy, who sat proudly at the bedside, tail thumping softly against the floor. A small smile crept across his lips. "I knew you'd come for me, boy." The next day, a local news crew got permission to visit the hospital. Cameras rolled as Walter, now sitting up with help, recounted the moment he realized he was still alive. "I couldn't move, couldn't speak," he said. "But I could hear. I heard Susan. I heard the commotion. And I knew Buddy was close." Buddy sat next to him during the interview, wearing a little medal a nurse had crafted from a lanyard and a soda cap. It read, "Loyal beyond death." The story captured hearts everywhere. People who had never believed in miracles started reconsidering. And those who always trusted the loyalty of dogs finally had a story to prove it. Walter may have been saved by medicine, but it was love and a dog's undying loyalty that brought him back. By the time Walter had regained enough strength to leave his hospital bed, the story of his miraculous survival had already gone global. What began as whispers in a small Ohio chapel had now turned into a full-blown media phenomenon. Journalists from national networks waited outside the hospital with cameras ready. Photographers camped for hours, hoping to capture the now famous golden retriever who wouldn't stop barking at a coffin. Inside, Walter was still processing everything. He had cheated death not by technology or some miracle drug, but because a dog had refused to believe he was gone. "I guess I've got a stubborn friend," Walter joked to Susan, his voice still raspy but growing stronger. "You've got a hero," she replied, scratching behind Buddy's ears as the dog rested contentedly at Walter's bedside. The hospital staff, moved by the story, just like the rest of the world, treated Buddy like royalty. Nurses brought him treats, a soft blanket, and even a little ID badge that read Hospital Hero VIP Access. He roamed the hallway freely, never straying too far from Walter. On Walter's 5th day in recovery, the mayor of Maple Ridge, Gerald Lanson, paid him a visit with an unexpected announcement. "We're throwing a parade," he said, grinning. "Not for you, sorry, Walter. This one's for Buddy." Walter laughed, coughing slightly. "He deserves it more than I do." The town pulled together like never before. Within a week, Main Street was decorated with banners that read, "Thank you, Buddy," and Maple Ridge's four-legged miracle. People brought their pets to celebrate. Children wore golden retriever ears made from construction paper. Shops sold T-shirts that read, "I bark for Buddy." Walter, still too weak to walk on his own, was wheeled onto a stage set up in front of the courthouse. Susan stood beside him, beaming with pride. But all eyes were on Buddy, who trotted across the stage, wearing a custom-fitted service vest and his loyal beyond death mettle. When the mayor called his name, Buddy barked once, causing the entire crowd to erupt in applause. You see, the mayor announced, "We call dogs man's best friend," but Buddy reminded us that sometimes there's something even greater, a guardian, a soulmate, a lifesaver. Tears filled Walter's eyes as he leaned down and whispered to Buddy, "You pulled me back, didn't you, boy?" Buddy responded with a gentle nuzzle under Walter's arm. News crews filmed every moment. One anchor from a major network called it the story that reminded the world what unconditional love looks like. Letters poured in from across the country. Schools sent class projects thanking Buddy. A retired Navy K-9 trainer even offered to certify Buddy as an honorary service. Dogs stating he did something most trained dogs never do. By the end of the week, Walter's hospital room resembled a florist's shop. Cards lined the windowsills. Teddy bears, framed pictures, even dog toys arrived daily. But nothing meant more to Walter than having Buddy curled up at his feet each night. "I don't need flowers," Walter told a visiting journalist. "I just need him." The bond between man and dog, already deep, had become legendary. Walter's second chance at life wasn't just a miracle. It was proof that loyalty, love, and instinct could defy the grave. And as the cameras slowly left, and Maple Ridge returned to normal, everyone who'd witnessed the miracle agreed on one thing. This was more than a story about survival. It was a story about love refusing to let go. As Walter continued to recover at home, comfortably settled into his recliner with Buddy curled at his feet, a new wave of interest surrounded them, not just from journalists or neighbors, but from scientists and doctors across the country. The unusual medical event had piqued the attention of the academic world. What exactly had happened to Walter, and how in the world did his dog know? Within weeks, a team of neurologists from the State University arrived to run tests and conduct interviews. They reviewed hospital footage, spoke with the funeral director, the paramedics, and the medical staff. Their conclusion? Walter had experienced a rare form of catalepsy, a condition where the body becomes rigid, pulse and breath nearly undetectable, mimicking death with terrifying precision. His body shut down just enough to fool everyone, said Dr. Elaine Kessler, the lead researcher. In centuries past, people with this condition were sometimes buried alive. It's extremely rare now, but in Walter's case, it was triggered by a mix of medications and stress. But what fascinated Dr. Kessler even more was Buddy's role. Animals sense things we can't. It's not magic, it's biology, she explained. Dogs have highly attuned senses. Some can detect drops in blood sugar, cancer cells, seizures. Buddy likely picked up on Walter's shallow breathing, or even the change in scent from his skin. He knew Walter wasn't truly gone. Susan listened, amazed. So Buddy's not just loyal. He's a medical marvel? Dr. Kessler smiled. In a way, yes. He's part of a growing group of animals whose instincts can outpace human instruments. Soon after, Buddy was invited to participate in a study on canine intuition and medical detection. But Walter politely declined. He's done enough, he said. He doesn't need to prove himself to anyone. Meanwhile, people continued to visit from all over, some with sick loved ones, others just wanting to meet the dog who wouldn't give up. Walter welcomed them all with a warm smile and a wag of Buddy's tail. He answered every question patiently, told the story over and over, but never tired of it. Because every time he said it aloud, he remembered how close he'd come to disappearing. Forever. Local schools invited him to speak at assemblies. Buddy would sit on stage, calm and dignified, while Walter explained how even the smallest actions, like refusing to be quiet, could save a life. Children asked, "How did Buddy know?" Walter always gave the same answer, "Because love doesn't quit, national news returned once again to do a follow-up piece. The reporter noted, Walter Jenkins was rescued from a casket by a dog who simply wouldn't stop barking. But this story has turned into something bigger, a symbol of loyalty, instinct, and second chances. Animal advocacy groups reached out, offering to sponsor Buddy as their honorary ambassador. One even sent a golden trophy shaped like a paw, with the engraving, "For courage, loyalty, and unbreakable love." Walter placed it on the mantel right next to a framed American flag from his military days. But the most touching moment came quietly, one evening when Walter sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Buddy sat beside him, ears perked, tail brushing against Walter's foot. "Some say dogs can smell death," Walter said aloud. "But you didn't smell death, did you? You smelled life. You knew I wasn't ready." Buddy looked up and gave a soft woof. Resting his head on Walter's lap. Science could explain some of it, how dogs detect subtle body changes, the rare medical condition that mimics death, but no study could fully explain the depth of the connection between Walter and Buddy. That bond was beyond logic, beyond science, beyond belief. It was something deeper, something truly miraculous. Walter Jenkins sat in his favorite porch chair, a blanket over his legs, and Buddy resting beside him as the evening breeze carried the soft hum of crickets. His life, once ordinary and quiet, had taken a turn few could imagine. He had been to the edge, declared dead, nearly buried, and brought back because one faithful dog refused to stay silent. That kind of miracle, Walter felt, came with responsibility. In the weeks following the media storm and medical curiosity, Walter felt a pull to do something more, something lasting. "I've been given a second chance," he told Susan one morning, pouring coffee into his favorite mug. "Not everyone gets that. I want to use it." It didn't take long for him to decide what that meant. He would dedicate the rest of his days to helping rescue dogs like Buddy and the people who needed them most. With Susan's help, he launched a non-profit foundation called Buddy's Promise. Its mission was simple yet powerful: to train rescue dogs as emotional support and medical alert companions for the elderly, the ill, and the lonely. Within a month, word of the foundation had spread, and donations came pouring in from every corner of the country. People moved by Walter's story wanted to be a part of something meaningful. The first dog Buddy's Promise trained was a scrappy black Labrador named Shadow. Shadow had been found wandering behind a gas station, underfed and anxious. But under the guidance of trainers and with Buddy as a sort of canine mentor, Shadow transformed into a gentle, attentive service dog for a retired school teacher living with Parkinson's. Walter visited the woman personally. When Shadow gently climbed into her lap and she began to cry, Walter felt something shift in his soul. "This," he whispered to Susan, "is what we were meant to do." Buddy remained by Walter's side every step of the way. Despite being older now, his energy returned with purpose. He participated in public demonstrations, appeared at fundraisers, and was even the subject of a children's book titled Buddy Barks for Life, which became a bestseller. Teachers across the country read it aloud in classrooms, inspiring children. With the story of a dog who wouldn't give up on his human. Walter also wrote a memoir, Married but Not Gone: How My Dog Pulled Me Back from the Edge. In it, he detailed his experience, what little he remembered, the terrifying stillness, and the moment he first heard Buddy's bark. "It was like an anchor to life," he wrote. "I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, but I heard my boy, and I knew I wasn't alone." The book launched Walter into speaking engagements at universities and veteran organizations. He talked about love, loyalty, the importance of paying attention to what others miss, especially the instincts of animals. Every time he finished speaking, someone would ask to pet Buddy, and Walter always said yes. Years passed. Buddy aged gracefully, his muzzle turning silver, his steps slower, but his spirit as bright as ever. Walter cherished every extra day they'd been gifted. When the inevitable came, and Buddy passed quietly one night in his sleep, Walter held him close and whispered, "You saved me, and now it's my turn to carry your mission forward." Buddy was laid to rest under the maple tree in Walter's backyard, beside a small stone etched with the words, "He barked for life. He loved without end." Walter continued his work with the foundation, his voice now carrying Buddy's legacy. Forward, and across the country, people who'd heard the story would smile whenever they saw a golden retriever. They remembered the dog who barked at a coffin and woke up the world, the dog who refused to let death win, the dog who loved so deeply. He pulled life back from silence.